Go ahead, say it. I'm pointing at you, Dave.
Oh, God.
That's my cue. Sorry.
Sure,
Dave
go
Marcus. Dave Marcus from the Intel world. Glad to be here, guys.
Well, it's
Awesome.
good to have you. We just finishing off our people, process, and technology podcast. The previous podcast we had technology as kind of the last leg of that stool. But as we always like to do, we like to bring in a guest to kind of accentuate and help show the different facets of that. So, from a technology perspective, Dave, you come from Intel now, and we've known you for many years. You're a very heavy player in the cybersecurity world. Intel,
Appreciate being
wow,
called heavy.
heavy. Well,
I don't know how to take that, gentlemen. I don't know. I don't know how to take that.
no, we love you, Dave. I mean, here's what it is, right? You're an Intel, right? And that's traditionally an engineering company. We build intelligent devices, widgets, things that have lots of sprockets and gold ends and need fans to cool because they're working at super fast scales. Cybersecurity, how does that melt together? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you've done, and just kind of give us a little who's who.
Sure, great place to start. So I've just rejoined Intel about 10, 11 months ago, from the more traditional security world, right? The McAfee world that we all worked at together, then left and went to Looking Glass for a little while to manage their intelligence teams and stuff like that. So I've got a very well-rounded view of threats in general, and then different kinds of technologies dealing with different aspects of the threat landscape. So it's been 20 years or so of experience of understanding threats at different levels. What can be done on the network? What can't be done on the network? What can be done on the host? What can't be done on the host? What can be done on the platform? What can't be done on the platform? Um, because I think one thing that we all kind of understand is you can't do everything everywhere, right? You can't really effectively necessarily mitigate certain network threats from a host device or certain host threats from a network device, right? So having that kind of that holistic understanding of threats is something that I do and I bring to Intel on the federal team because I'm kind of the threat guy. I bring an understanding of the threat landscape, an understanding of adversarial tradecraft, an understanding of adversarial activities, how one adversary does things different than another adversary. And then I find ways of testing things like that against platform functionality or figuring out things in platform functionality that can help mitigate certain types of threats at certain levels of the platform or working with partners and stuff. And so it's really just utilizing my background in threats to figure out what the platform can do to mitigate those things in an appropriate way, and then coming up with cool use cases to show it.
That's interesting. You use the terminology platform, right? And when we traditionally look at a platform, we traditionally look at endpoint. We look at maybe a network appliance of some type or some type of system. But from an Intel's perspective, they get at a deeper level. And I think from a bad actor's perspective, I think bad actors have been making a deliberate attempt to try to go after technology at its core, right? Maybe at the common denominator. And in many cases, it would be a chip manufacturer such as Intel that would be in the actual target behind the target. And so Intel's taking cybersecurity serious. And from that, they have a large scale of product out there, and sometimes get unduly pointed at as, hey, why aren't you hardening here? But the cycles for developing hardware are long. It takes years.
Yep.
Threats happen almost overnight these days. So
Like
how
that.
do you bridge the two together from a cybersecurity into a technology viewpoint?
Sure, there's a lot to unpack in that statement, right? So
Yeah.
it's a particular platform is going to be deployed for a long period of time, right? It's the legacy issue. Even though there's, let's just say, Xeon Generation 4, and they're coming out with Xeon Generation 5 soon, that doesn't mean 3, 2, and 1 are not in the market anymore, out in the marketplace anymore, right? You know, so there's a huge legacy footprint of certain technologies. Some later versions of technologies have different functionality than earlier ones, obviously. So they can't all necessarily do, you know, the same things. There are extensions in the later technology platforms that are not in some of the earlier ones. You know, so you can't develop endpoint solutions or network solutions or device solutions in the same way for earlier ones that you could, you know, for later ones and stuff like that. And that's just part of that's just part of the landscape of development and stuff like that. But when it comes to things like vulnerability management and things like that, I mean, there's certain practices that we follow that everybody else follows, right? You know, as soon as there's a vulnerability, fine, you know, remediate it, push the patch out there. So from the point of view of those kinds of cycles, you know, it's relatively the same, but it's always a fight with getting things in the platform that we think are going to have the largest impact for protecting the platform itself and then being able to be extended by partners to develop things on top of the platform. So it's a combination of both, right? You know, it's developing stuff to harden the platform, and there's a ridiculous amount of stuff in both the client and the server stuff that goes into the hardening of the platform with memory encryption and stuff like that. And then there's the stuff that we build like SGX and TDX and some of the other things that can be used as extensions for partners to actually develop toward and build actual secure enclaves and actually be memory separation between applications and stuff like that. So it's a balancing act, Andrew, to answer the question, to bring it back to what you were talking about, is to harden the platform, and then also to develop the things and get things into the platform that can be used to do other things like application acceleration, application cryptography, and things like that. So it's a balancing act. And then realizing that the things that we produce are going to be out there for extended periods of time. And, you know, this is how it always is in many ways. But yeah, you're right in the sense that threats develop, you know, like that, right? So you have to be prepared to respond. And internally at Intel, they've got they've got great teams that respond, you know, to those kinds of things that are found that we actually will push out and develop and stuff like that. So I hope that
You
answers the question. It was a long-winded answer. Apologies.
Yeah, but I liked it. I liked it. One of the things it brought up though is, and it made me think about it, that because we're dealing with hardware, because we're dealing with platforms, because we're dealing with technology, the forethought of Intel has to be 10, 15 years in the future with regard to how things will change. It's very hard, you know, because if you're not, then your stuff. I mean, we all know technology is almost immediately obsolete, but the problem is with chips and stuff like that. You're producing those chips, operating systems will go on them. You can't do advanced stuff if you don't have the framework to actually produce and create that stuff. So it's kind of just me. This is me anecdotally just shooting my mouth off, but the reality is Intel's perspective on that is it has to be far reaching, because or else their product doesn't have a long lifespan, and therefore, you know, it's of no use anymore. So
No, that's a fair statement, and I don't think in terms of technological obsolescence anymore. I think in terms of features that have lifespans, right? If you really think about it, right? You
right.
know, so again, just because a CPU or a platform is X number of years old doesn't necessarily mean it's obsolete. It just means it doesn't have certain features in it that maybe is far-reaching with lifespan as some others are. But that being said, some of the older CPU cycles that are out there are also locked down in very, very different ways. You know, so like the stuff that goes into a Cisco device is not necessarily going to be of the same build and production that's, let's say, something is in a server closet inside a cloud farm is. You know, even though some of the CPUs are going to be the same, the way it's deployed and fused and pushed out may be very, very different depending upon the situation and the development path of it and stuff like that. So I try not to think in terms of obsolescence. I try to think in terms of just feature lifespan, and some features have a longer lifespan, you know, than others. Some get adopted quicker than others do. And again, you know, Intel, we think in terms, and when I say we, I mean, you know, the larger company, even though I'm a threat guy, is acceleration and lifespan, right? Is what can we build into the platform that can be used by the market for a variety of use cases, security being one of the biggest ones.
Hey, listen, I can commiserate with that, because I've worked places that still are utilizing AS400s. I mean, IBM is still selling AS400s. Yeah, and the platform has
It's still usable.
yeah.
It still has a lifespan. you can say certain features in there are not, let's just say, cutting edge, right? If you really want to think about it, right?
Right.
Um, and in some ways, their technological difficulty in deployment almost serves a purpose in security in its own way because it doesn't run the same way. It's not accessible in the same way. Usually it's when you get to those conjoined things, right, that things start becoming problematic. Like when you want to connect your AS400 to a web server that's publicly accessible, not really a smart idea, right? Things like that open up other things that, there was no thought of making certain things web accessible or iPad accessible, right? And making them so gives you a conjoined threat landscape that is problematic, because it was never meant to be deployed and accessed in a particular way. And adding in newer things without considering their impact to the existing technology is problematic. And people don't tend to think a lot of those things for, you know.
So really you're looking at the software as the transport mechanism to utilize the hardware, right? So in this
Some
in
way.
this case of the AS in the AS400 world, right? It may not be web centric. It may not be web savvy or the best use case for an AS400, but it sure as heck can run a big database. It sure as heck can run multi-processing going on in the back end to be able to serve up the catalogs, to serve up the data, to be able to hold the PII and be able to secure that because in some cases, those larger systems have a more mature security role responsibility landscape.
Yep.
So
That's a great way.
using its
That's
strength.
a great way of thinking about it. Yep.
So using its strengths, but being able to augment it to get that ROI that people are looking for, right? I said that
You
ROI,
said
right?
you
Yeah,
said the
everybody
ROI word,
wants.
Andrew. Yep. Take a
I
drink.
did, I did,
Yep. You
because it's
said
a
the word.
segue. It's a segue, because the segue is this. So large companies can enjoy a longer ROI because they have the ability to do development, custom development. They have the ability to influence larger companies to maybe programming houses or development companies to build something that's shelfware, customize that shelfware for the next version or whatever. But what in the case of the SMB, right? I may be a small practice. I may be maybe several offices, a legal firm that's multi-states, but I'm not. But I'm not a big blip on anybody's radar because I have a smaller footprint. In those cases, to get that big ROI, um, you know, that shelf life of whatever the hardware is, the software, and the combination thereof, that culmination of both, may not be there or may be stretched, and I may be sacrificing features that I need for the threat landscape du jour, um, to be able to get the extra mileage out of that hardware device or that appliance or that software that's talking to that device. What is the fix there? Is like how do we keep ahead of it without just kind of going to a big box store or something and just buying another router or buying another, whatever device or computer or whatever? Yeah, those features are great and the longevity of that stuff, but
Mhm.
how do we combat the the real tight dollar for our SMB customers?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think it comes down to making the features that are in those platforms available for development to the developers that develop for the SMB customers, right?
Okay.
So it's bridging that gap. So just because something gets deployed in an Azure cluster, let's just say,
Yeah.
so let's just say we've got some features that really shine in an Azure cluster or an AWS cluster. That doesn't mean those features can't be scaled down or developed towards smaller markets and stuff like that. It just comes down to developing the feature with the market in mind, because I don't think there's anything under the hood of any of the platforms that market specific or that market exclusionary in any way, shape, or form. I just think the developers for the SMB markets just need to understand they can develop containerization that can run inside of an SGX enclave for the SMB market, just like it can be for larger markets and stuff like that. And actually, it may be more applicable in some ways. I'm a huge advocate of containerization, by the way, things like Docker and and a lot of those technologies that run things in containers because it's kind of like micro VMs in a certain way, right? It's running inside the Docker container And if you can run things in a Docker container, you can run them in these what are known as these SGX enclaves, which are cryptographically isolated enclaves that are driven by the actual platform and stuff like that. So that's not market specific, right? That's not something that you would deploy for one market for another. It's application specific, right? And SMBs run applications just like any other market runs, and just like any other customer base runs applications, right? It's application specific. So I think it's more of an awareness thing sometimes, Andrew, than it is necessarily a SMBs not using it and it's only for this particular market. I think we just need to make them aware that there's these features under the hood, and it just takes a certain amount of development to make them specific or more utilizable, if that's even a word, to the SMB market.
Is now.
It is now.
Well, okay. So really does if we look at from an SMB perspective, and I'm picking on SMBs because I think they're somewhat underserved in some of the larger markets. It's the analogy of right church, wrong pew, right? We're in the right place. We're in the technology area, but the pew we have to sit in is not to own the AS400, not to own the large data farms or data lakes or whatever. Maybe for me, the right answer is use more cloud services.
That actually might be an excellent way of looking at it, because going back to that exact analogy, there's certain things, like I said before, that really shine in Azure clusters and AWS clusters and stuff like that. Like this whole thought of SGX enclaves and virtualization really shines in that environment when you really think about it, right? Guess what? That makes the SMB applications that much more secure because they're running in their own virtualized containers and everything else. So it's not an either or, right? It's a positioning statement. If those SMBs are running in cloud environments, those cloud environments should be taking advantage of things like TGX, TDM, and SGX and stuff like that. It just may be an awareness that because they're not doing it, rather than it's not appropriate for SMBs. Because I would argue containerization and virtualization and stuff like that are applicable for every market. It's even applicable, honestly, in certain endpoint instances. You can even run things on your own desktop in containers. So it's not to say it's applicable in one and not in the other. It's an awareness thing. I loved your analogy.
Thinking about that and then just extrapolating for that, SMBs in and of themselves, we think of them as, something more, it's just a monetary value of a business. And generally that relates to a maturity level of how they think that they need to be appropriately attached to. And utilizing cloud is a great way, cloud services that are respectable and already established and have a well-entrenched security program are a good way to go. It's the smaller versions of those things that give me pause, where I'm not appropriating and or implementing the correct security measures in the cloud, but yet I'm selling a service to whomever and creating opportunities for threats. That's the thing I would warn or caution our audiences about, is just based upon the fact is you need to understand who you're storing your data with, what you're doing with it, because a lot of this comes down to data. I mean, let's face it, that ends up being what we're protecting.
Sure.
And data privacy becomes the focal point of a lot of information security protections. And if you don't know where you're putting your data, the security of that, and I like what you're saying, the technologies are there to make this much more secure than even probably are implemented at this juncture. It's my encouragement to see that, to take a sharp eye or take a cautious eye at what the implementation of the product you want to use is doing. Look at their security if you can, even from a high level, even if you don't understand it, or ask somebody like us.
Yep.
So, PSA done.
And really, when you step back and think about what the attacker is doing or what the bad guy is actually doing, right? 9 times out of 10, what are they looking for? They're looking for data in some way, shape, or form, right? A lot of things are just a stepping stone to getting the data or the bits that are actually important, right? Except when you get down to certain adversaries that are really looking for, let's just say, persistence in a network because they want to do something later. That's a different argument, right? But at the end of the day, they're still ultimately looking for something, and that something is usually data, right? Whether it's specifically PII data or it's corporate data, or it's government data or something like that. It comes down to a data-based or data-centric attack in some way, shape, or form. So the question should always be in the back of somebody's mind is, what am I protecting, right? Is ultimately, what am I protecting, and start there. I mean, it's like if you've read some of the original zero trust documentation, right? With where you start for figuring out a zero trust strategy. It comes down for picking an asset, right? Pick an asset. Just start with one asset on one land and figure out how you access that particular asset. And the Kipling kind of policy: who, what, when, where, why, and how of how that access is actually happening. Pick an asset and pick what you're trying to protect, and then build out, from there. But start by thinking in terms of, what are you looking to protect, right? That's a great place to start. It sounds overly simplistic, and it kind of is. But it's hard to get around how powerful that is, right? Is, what are you trying to actually protect? It's like the classic question we've all been struggling with our careers, is like getting the customer to understand, what are you trying to protect?
Mhm.
That's the primary question.
Yeah.
It's interesting you said that. And one of you'll hear it at the end, but I have a quote that I always quote. It hits that point right there. But you know, you mentioned zero trust, and I always like to ask this: zero trust is a marketing term that has been applied and applied and applied and applied. Um, I consider the reality of zero trust most likely is like the 50% rule. We're getting closer and closer and closer, but we never get there. There's always an opening, there's always an issue. I would love to hear your thoughts on zero trust in today and the future, because the reality is it is so over marketed. It's hard to even know what it is anymore in people's
Sure.
eyes.
Sure. And I actually like the zero. I like when you step away from all the marketing stuff and stuff like that. I like the concept of zero trust, because at the end of the day, what that actually means is this: is it means doing business in a compromised environment. You have the ability to operate securely in a compromised environment. You have zero trust in the environment, but you need to operate in a secure manner in that environment. That really is what a lot of it comes down to. And then, how do you build out around that? Because it's a process, right? You never get to the point where you've deployed zero trust. It doesn't work like that. It gets to the point where you're actually segregating data from things that are not supposed to be accessing that data, unless they can prove that they are supposed to be accessing that data for a period of time and being continually evaluated, right? That's some of the cornerstones of zero trust: is prove that you need to get to that asset, prove who you are, prove you have a certain device health, so to speak, and then you're granted access for a period of time. You're going to be completely monitored, and we're going to use those analytics, for our advantage going forward and stuff like that. And I actually like that. As far as strategies go, I think there's really a lot to that. I just think, considering the business that we are all in, it goes down a very marketing specific and very technologically niche route and stuff like that. And some people do it better than others. And some of the focus that my team actually does, or the team that I'm on rather, is how can some of the things that are in the Intel platform better provide zero trust capabilities, right? So how can people develop their zero trust solutions using platform functionality and stuff like that? And those are some of the questions that we actually try to answer. So if you're deploying that endpoint solution, you know, have you considered deploying it in an SGX enclave that is cryptographically secure? That makes your application that much more zero trusty, right? Because it's actually isolated from a lot of other attacks and a lot of stuff like that. So you can look at it a couple of ways, right,
Right.
Angela? You can look at it from the point of view of how you enforce zero trust, or you can look at it from the point of view of how you help make the zero trust solutions zero trust solutions. So there's a couple of different ways to actually look at it. Without getting too philosophical.
No, I think you hit it right on the head, and I'm glad you said that. Zero trust, I think, has been hijacked by marketing a little bit too much, right? Zero trust is not a destination.
Correct.
It's a methodology, it's a process,
Yes,
and
sir.
where
Yep.
you systematically, programmatically ratchet down several facets of it.
Yep.
Networking, data, users, work streams, all that
Yep.
comes into play. And the enclaving of those things where you have, segregation,
Yep.
so you can't spill over to another bucket.
Yep.
That's part of zero trust.
Yep.
It's not zero trust in its entirety.
Correct.
And I think this is where marketing tends to derail zero trust or give us a bad taste in the cybersecurity world, where it's like, well, you buy my appliance and you're zero trust. You're zero trust certified is my favorite thing. There is no certification for zero trust.
It is funny, isn't it?
Well,
And so,
that brings up a whole certification. Brings up a whole other subject. What,
but,
what
but
is what is
listen,
cybersecurity certification?
I went through the Forrester
Yeah,
Research certification for that stuff. And the first thing they tell you is, you know, forget everything you know about zero trust. And then you start going through the exercises, you start going through the use cases and stuff, and you very quickly realize it's identifying your risk, identifying where that risk is coming from, and then mitigating it and quantifying it and managing it to the lesser or to no risk.
Yep.
oh wait, hold on. Do
Yeah.
security better? That's really what we're saying.
Yep.
That's kind
it
of what you're
actually,
saying is you got it. Well, doing security better and not having blinders and thinking only one
correct.
software appliance or process is going to fix it.
Yeah.
It's 360 degrees. It's your whole environment that has to be a part of it. And I think the weak chain principle really applies here. The weak chain is what's going to bite you.
Oh, that's so true. At least if you look at some of Kinderberg's, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, some of the original writings of Kinderberg on the zero trust stuff, he even says that it's all technologically dependent upon a lot of other technologies. It's not one technology based
Right.
upon the nature of threats and protections and layers and stuff like that. So there is by nature an interaction between technologies, in a zero trust environment and stuff like that. So your weak link analogy in there, Andrew, I think is pretty spot on. When it's funny. You come right down to it. You boil it down to it. You boil it down to the simplest thing. It's going to be an asset and how you access that asset, right? Microsegmentation. And I think that is the fundamental cornerstone of it. But that is not a new concept, right?
Right.
None of it is actually a new concept in any way, shape, or form. It's just understanding. It's more understanding how you deploy them together and how you quantify it, right? That's that. And I think that there's a lot of value to that particular part of it. But even the original writing would tell you that there's nothing really new here. It's more just how he applies the layers and actually how he quantifies how you get to the asset. And the power of it really is that policy, right? That who, what, when, where, why, how policy. Kipling. It's the fundamental Kiplinger policy, which is who, what, when, where, why, and how. And how you evaluate how that policy accesses asset A, right?
And trust nothing. And trust nothing throughout that whole questioning.
Yep. And that's the whole point of that policy. The whole point of that policy is if you can't prove those things, you don't get access to my asset, right? So it's completely based on access rules and stuff like that, which is fascinating because when you go back to the original of application of routing protocols and switching protocols, a lot of that comes back to access control lists and access rules and stuff like that. So what's fascinating is there's a circle in there of getting back to access control lists and access control rules. And boy, doesn't that sound familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're in the industry long enough, things come right back, don't they?
That's so true. If you stand on the edge of the river long enough, it loops and floats back by. That's really true. But I do think there is a lot of power in the thinking toward coming up with a zero trust architecture. I do think that there's a lot of value in that. Just stepping back and understanding you got to separate that from the marketing terms, and stuff like that. And sometimes it's hard for people, to do. But I do think there's a lot of value in it.
And I would like to say this: marketing does play a role in this, and the reason it plays a role is because most people wouldn't even know what zero trust is unless it was marketed out there. And to be frank, most people don't know what zero trust is, but maybe never even heard of it until it was marketed in such a way. So it wouldn't be important. It wouldn't be, would it be, part of our standards? Would it be driving towards those things if it hadn't had some type of market push? So I don't want to belittle marketing from the point of that, but conversely, I would like to have marketing be more true.
No,
So
not at all.
Realistic.
There's value in how you position it. And let's be honest, the reason the threat landscape is so well known today is because it gets news play, right? If you go back 5 or 7 years ago, or go back to when we all worked back in endpoint security back in the day, there was not a lot of awareness of it outside of spam and email, but now cyber threats are front news. cyber threats lead on news stories and stuff like that. So the marketing value around it is huge, and the counterbalance of defense technologies is certainly a fair part of that discussion, right? So in a way, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? They're marketing a lot of solutions, but that's also because cyber threats get front line news these days. You
Yeah.
know, you
The
can't
dollar
really
amounts are
escape that.
bigger. The dollar amounts are bigger, right? It becomes a newsworthy story.
Exactly.
There's people's day, look in the past 10 years, mergers, acquisitions, right? Um, when mergers and acquisitions happen, databases merge,
Yep.
security measures get crashing together. There's disparity between them. And in some cases, there are gaps that occur, right?
Yep.
And if you don't do your due diligence and if you don't do your proper your proper amalgamation of two companies smashing together, um problems happen, things go bump in the night, and these are bigger and bigger problems, and I think we're facing that as a result.
Yep. Agreed. And it goes back to your weak link analogy, Andrew, right? So you've got that, those two companies that merge and stuff like that. Let's say you've got one company that really has its act together on the cyber side, right? They've really got their act together technologically, policy wise, management wise, and stuff like that. And they end up getting a company that, let's just say, doesn't. Um,
Yeah.
where does it's usually a dilution, right? It's not necessarily that the other company comes up really, really quickly to where that company that's getting it all right. It's usually some combination, some dilution of it and stuff like that. And that's where the adversary is generally very adept is those weaknesses and stuff like that. They're not going to target the strong part of the solution. They're going to target the weak part of the
Yeah.
solution. And that's going to be generally a lot of the same stuff you, me, and Angelo have always dealt with. Email stuff, social engineering stuff, all that stuff still works magic, in today's landscape. The human side of the equation is always going to be the weakest link in the technological landscape, right? You'll always be able to get somebody to click something they're not supposed to be clicking. Always.
Yeah. I've there's one wise man that I remember telling me, he says it's far easier to pull somebody down than pull somebody up.
Yep.
And that's the case here. And I think the machination, at least in the recent years, is from a compliance perspective, not necessarily the big companies smashing together, because I think they're being held to similar standards and they're starting to adhere to that. I think it's this way.
Yep.
Larger companies are mandating suppliers, VARs, vendors to come up to their standard.
Yep.
And I think small companies are suffering because of this, because they have to now adhere to these regulations. I mean, Angelo, you can probably give example after example of just how many partners um called up your practice and said, "Oh my goodness, these large companies that I'm working for, they're going to threaten
Wants
my
to have a security program.
yeah,
You know,
we need a
want to,
security program that has to match theirs."
yeah.
Yep.
Or
And we don't have the money,
need to be
right?
GDPR compliant.
Yep.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It's and these things are issues. Have to privacy impact assessment. How you handle confidential data. All these things flow together and cause a company. Most companies don't even have what's needed, much less have the evidence of being compliant. I that's the way I begin with most of my clients. I say, hey, listen, we need to get you to what compliance is, and then you need to show evidence therein so that you can actually pass an audit. If you're never going to, you need to take all these steps and then follow them. And most people think it's, just give me the little piece of paper and we move forward. And it's time explaining that this is a change in process. This is a change in procedure. This is a change in how you see the stuff you work with. And that's where I spend a lot of my time reevaluating and building it, the business process in. And yes, we get hit with a lot of different standards and requirements that people need to adhere to. And there is no magic bullet. There is no just cream you can rub on it and make everything better. It is you gotta get something cut off. You're gonna have to put something on it, and you gotta just do rehab. So it's the way things are today.
Policy and then evidence of compliance to policy are
Mhm.
two very different things, right?
Absolutely.
You've got a book of policies that you have to be compliant to. Okay, I've got my book of policies that I have to be compliant to, and
Mhm.
then showing and proving that you're compliant to an audit are two completely, different things. And there's money that's in there, and there's, if you're, and I'd imagine one of the biggest issues is that the SMB is concerned with the B in the B, right? They're
Mhm.
concerned with
Yep.
the brick and mortar aspect of their business, paying the bills, selling stuff, engaged in the service, that they're actually providing and stuff like that. And all the other stuff is going to be of secondary concern, probably, or tertiary concern, even, right? So I'd imagine in that market, because that's not, I'm not an expert here, you guys are, is price point is a real big deal. Is
Oh
being
yeah.
able to actually provide that in some bundled format or service that is, approachable to their price points and stuff like that. And boy, that can't be easy.
Well, that's why, like, for instance, I've been a CISO. It's, that's where the gray hair comes from.
Yeah.
You know, not my two girls or not. No, it's the gray hair. So the
Blame the wife.
reality is when you do those things, and now most of these companies not only can't afford a security program, they can't afford a CISO, they can't afford maybe even the software to implement what's required. So you're duct taping and assembling something that formulates into a strategy, a solution that they can present to somebody else so they can continue to do business. So but the reality is, yeah, you're right. The price point is a big concern because to build these structures, to build these things, that's where I end up coming in. That's why I'm coming in these virtual states to help them get to that place. Otherwise they would just be rudderless. They'd
Mhm.
be answering questions like, oh yeah, we do stuff for security, we got security. And
Yep.
people who are in the security field look at these third-party assessments and go, we can't do business with these people.
Yep.
And that's what's happening. This is the impetus and structure of how we go forward here is outside our industry pushing back on people to say, hey, you need to get compliant, you need to get some security program in place, you need to do something. And hopefully cyber insurance saying, hey, we're not going to be able to cover you unless you have these things. um, and and maybe some type of federal push. Policy at the federal level has been kind of wishy-washy, and
Mhm.
then state level has been a crapshoot. So the reality is you end up in this kind of torrent of pulling different things pulling at you to try to get to what you deem to be compliant. It is a not fun activity, and unless you go with the idea that you want to accomplish it and you're willing to put in the effort, the
Mm.
desire to accomplish it, you're probably not going to succeed. You need to have a corporate push, whether that corporation is 5 people or 100,000 people. The top level corporation needs to say, "I want to be compliant,"
Yep.
or I want to have a security program. I use compliance, mind you, as a level of security program. We'll say at a level of maturity. We all know compliance is not the answer. And if compliance was the answer, a lot of these breaches wouldn't occur. But the reality is, it's the security program. It's the
Sure.
looking at and reevaluating, the constant monitoring. All those things need to be in place.
And I think sometimes compliance doesn't get its due, um, it's due respect in some ways, because the only thing I would actually push back on is compliance does show you're doing something, right? It does
Agreed.
show that you're trying to do X number of things, right? You're trying to do this, you're trying to do that, trying to do the other thing, and stuff like that. So, is compliance to a program necessarily mean a really, really effective program? Not necessarily, sure. But it does show that the company is doing something, right? And I
Yeah.
think that that's an important message, right? Is to the other supplier who's requiring them be compliant to XYZ, it does show, that they're trying to be compliant to X, Y, and Z, right?
Yep.
And I sometimes think it almost doesn't get its respect in some ways. Some people will kind of
Uh,
poo-poo compliance. Oh, that's just check boxes and stuff like that. Well, yeah, that's true. But that checkbox there for having a security program means I have and am managing a security program to a
Granted.
certain level that has gotten me compliant. And I think that is worthy of respect and publicity. You know what I mean?
If I was
And
going to call it out,
and
I would call out. Go ahead.
just to
You
pull,
want to say
just to
something there, Angelo?
pull, just to kind of put something else in there. Compliance doesn't mean that you're going to be resilient, right? It means that you've met a level of or a baseline of care and diligence.
Good word. Good word. Baseline. I like that.
It's a snapshot in time, unless you are looking at an ongoing. And it's what I was going to hit upon. Yes, you're dead on correct. Getting compliant is a great accomplishment. The issue at hand is most compliancy aspects. When you're looking at it, they're just trying to achieve a minimal state. That's my I guess my pushback. People are just not trying to overachieve, and the reason I push back, and that's where I push. But if you take an ISO 27001 or a SOC 2 Type 2, it's more of a yes, you're compliant, and how are you compliant, and what are you doing to maintain compliance, and show me how you do these things. That changes the perspective on yes, I have a security program, check. Yes, I have an incident response plan, check. Yes, I have this. It changes it from just a bunch of checkboxes to checkboxes and real evidence of use. I think that's where I think would be, I guess,
That's fair.
maybe the middle ground. We'll call it.
No, that's
Living that dream.
Yeah.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that some adversaries tend to like hosting providers, right? So if you think about an industry that serves a whole bunch of SMBs and stuff like that, um, if I put my adversary hat on for a second, I I like those environments because I have a one to many success ratio, right? Rather than targeting the individual, let's just say small petroleum provider and stuff like that. If I can leverage the business to business stuff, I get 10 of those rather than just one of those, right? You'll know if one aspect of them is not compliant, you'll know everybody that they're hosting and providing services for are not necessarily compliant. So it's those things that cause catastrophic problems down the line. It is that one to many thing of conjoined services, conjoined hostings, and things like that that are not necessarily up to a standard. You look at the historic ransomware problems when they've gone after a mid-level hoster that can then exploit business to business relationships and stuff like that. It's magic. You don't just get one particular company that you've nailed with your ransomware. You get 10, you get 12, you get 15, across a variety of industries, right?
Yep.
Because you guys know better than I do, is let's just say you provide services for a mid-level market. Chances are you're providing them for more than one thing at the mid-level, right? You're going to get more than one industry at that particular level. So I, as an adversary, may not just get petroleum as my target. I may get everything else that hosting company and conjoined provider actually provides services for. I don't just get one industry that I've owned. I get everything that they've necessarily owned. So it's a one to many success ratio that the bad guys just love. They love they love environments like that.
Yeah.
What I was just thinking of, just when you said that, the S3 buckets, how many of them are still searchable even
Yep.
today?
Yep.
There's search engines just to run through S3 buckets, and it's
Do it
kind of
on
sickening the amount
GitHub.
of data.
Dude, do it on a GitHub repository, right?
Oh,
Run a terminology search like UEFI malware on GitHub's main repository. You're going to find multiple repositories that are not just research centric, where here's some research code and stuff like that, but here's my compiled UEFI rootkit and stuff like that. So the availability of things through those things is
yeah.
even bigger than before. So you want to talk about going down the commoditization route. That's an even more interesting kind of discussion, right? Because again, going back to when we all used to work, for McAfee, certain types of threats and certain types of attacks were really not very prevalent, right? Like if you looked at rootkits and stuff at the firmware level and stuff like that, you never used to run into stuff like that, right? But now, or I take that back, or it used to be the purview of an advanced adversary like the Russians or the Chinese or something like that, really, really high-end malware and stuff like that, because it's not easy to write, firmware rootkits and low-level malware and stuff like that. Whereas now it's completely commoditized,
Yeah.
completely commoditized. You can go to GitHub and you can do searches for the most advanced malware and pull down fully compiled kits, pop it into your ransomware, pop it into your Trojans and stuff like that. And now you've got malware that just isn't malware. It also has persistence and a lot of other stuff. So that commoditization in every way has also benefited the threat landscape and made way advanced malware much more commoditized than it ever was before.
Well,
So
And add it to the target rich environment you're talking about, where it's like a hosted site that has multiple containers. Fracture the container, you get to the crunchy goodness inside.
Lemon squeezy, baby. Yep, you
That's
got
it.
it.
All right. So I'm gonna put you to a test here, Dave.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. I'm gonna invoke the prognosticator that we know that you are.
Oh, it's not. So it's not like a spelling test or anything.
No,
Okay.
no, 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 no. No, we don't spell here. That's what AI is for. No, so in the last few minutes that we have, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a historical perspective and then kind of the next 5 years from in these two perspectives. What did we do right and what should we have done better? Historical.
Hmm.
And then in the future, where do you see the industry going that will help cybersecurity either keep pace or get a leg up?
Interesting question. So taking off the Intel hat for a minute and thinking through the job that I had before I rejoined Intel, which was in the intelligence industry, which was in the intelligence and attack surface management side of the house and stuff like that. That was an area that I saw huge possibilities in and huge weaknesses in. Is the whole concept of attack surface management and not vulnerability management, but the attack surface as an entire attack surface, not necessarily just from the point of view of exposed vulnerabilities, but from the point of view of mapping networks, mapping entire IP blocks, mapping government blocks, mapping country blocks, things like that. That had a huge impact on my thinking, especially when the issues in the Ukraine started happening, and you started seeing things on the cyber side of the house before you saw things necessarily in the kinetic world. And that was a big eye opener, only because it's something we had been talking about in the industry for what, 10 years?
Yeah.
Is that there's going to be cybery things there's going to be a cyber aspect to kinetic warfare and stuff like that. So that particular instance had a big impact on me, is thinking through, and I think that there's lessons to be learned from there,
Oh yeah.
because the leading up to the Ukraine Russia stuff, and not even getting into the war aspect of that, but the profiling aspect of that, the stuff that we saw them trying to manipulate transportation on the cyber side of the house, that was a huge eye-opening experience. So I think that's a big thing going forward, is the true cyber inclusion in tactical warfare going forward. I think that's a done deal. And again, we've been
It's a game
talking
changer.
about that for years.
It's a game changer.
In every way.
It's changed the
But
books.
but again, I think about it specifically in terms of that attack landscape, or attack surface management, um, because there was a lot of stuff that we were seeing through attack surface management before it actually became evident in the actual world. So things like rerouting BGP routes, things like rerouting telco routes and stuff like that, we would actually see the changes and stuff like that in the tables and stuff like 12 hours before something happened. And then it got to be the point where if you saw certain changes, something's going to happen, right? So it was that aspect that had a huge impact on my thinking going forward, Andrew. So if I had to put a pin in something, I would say that particular incident um, is definitely a learning experience for things going forward. What worked well, what didn't work well, and the fact that we would see malware deployed against Ukrainian targets that you wouldn't see anyplace else. That became obvious very, very quickly. And I had the opportunity to work, and still work, with some people on the ground over there. And again, you would see stuff relegated to these IP blocks and country blocks that you wouldn't see anywhere else. It was that selective. So again, that kind of specificity was a huge learning experience for me, and how that affects the landscape in general going forward, I'm not 100% sure of, but I think there's a big attack surface management play going forward, and I think there's a huge SMB play in there for attack surface management, for all the reasons that we were talking about already, with issues in the SMB world, right? Not patching as quickly as others, libraries that are exposed that aren't exposed, SBOM issues, right? If you think about bomb issues and SBOM issues and stuff like that, all of that to me gets kind of bundled in your attack surface and what is actually exposed and things like that. So I think there's tremendous opportunities in the attack surface management world, the SBOM world, how you manage your bill of your cybersecurity bill of materials and stuff like that. I think is big. Obviously, I think the platform attack world is a big deal because again, all the things that we talked about before. It's easier to do UEFI malware. It's easier to do firmware attacks than it was before. That being said, there's more stuff in the new versions of the platforms than ever before as well. So bonus on that side of the house. But the commoditization of malware and the commoditization of attacks is probably the last thing I would put a pin in. Is just how it's become easier to do high level attacks than it ever was, previously. And I would wrap a lot of stuff into that. The malware stuff is easier to do than before. The network stuff is probably easier to do than before because all the tools have become so commoditized. But I'll get off my soapbox now.
No
It was
worries.
a good soapbox.
It was a good soapbox.
And
Absolutely.
take a breath
There you go.
off of that one. But
Well,
yeah, that was a heck of a learning experience. Was the whole stuff leading up to the invasion of Ukraine and all the cyber stuff that led up to it, specifically in the areas of transportation and energy. Um,
Yep.
it's a roadmap for the future.
What's funny is I think movies have illustrated that.
Yeah.
And and here we're actually seeing it in action. It's just kind of it's prophetic in a way, or not prophetic, just kind of what was going to happen. Evolutionary, maybe it's a term.
I would actually say it's more that than the other thing is. It's just like it's almost one of those told you so, told you it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Told you. And you actually saw. Remember what they used to talk about in the old days. That old people like the three of us talk about. You're not going to see stuff like that. They're not going to take it seriously until a hospital is knocked out. Or you can't turn on a machine at a hospital. Well, guess what? That train left the station already, right?
Yeah.
You've got ransomware that can shut down hospital wards. It's a done deal. You've got software that can affect the kinetic world. It's a done deal.
Do you think it's time for a new internet, an isolated internet?
I don't know that that's realistic.
Yeah.
It's I think you go back to your walled enclave, when you
Yes.
get to that, right? But I also go back to if you at least try and understand some of the tenets of zero trust, you can probably conduct business in those compromised environments because that's kind of what it's all about, right? Is you're supposed to be able to communicate securely or operate securely in a compromised environment by definition. That's what zero trust actually means. And I think that can be done. You just have to know how to protect your asset and how to communicate securely with the things that you want to allow to talk to that asset. So I don't know if the walled garden is realistic more than the manage your asset better at the end of the day. You know what I mean? And that's not to say they're completely diametrically opposed, Andrew, because I already see the wheels turning inside that noggin of yours. That's not to say they're opposed.
Right.
But I think one is more realistic than the other. I think the new internet walled garden thing, it's not really feasible necessarily, I think, anymore. But I think managing your asset and managing the access to your asset, I think that's manageable. I think that's doable.
I think you hit a point earlier when you started talking about shrinking down the security enclave, shrinking it down to, what it's going to do. Because we already shrink it down to the host. Now we're going to shrink it down to process. You start doing that, and you start thinking about it in that way. The internet becomes a different place. It's not the same place as me throwing up a web server with no security whatsoever on it. So it's some thoughts that we're going to have to work through.
Well, it's kind of fascinating if you take exactly what you said to its almost logical extreme. Everything becomes a endpoint at that particular point in some way, shape, or form. It's not completely analogous, but you know what I mean. And if you bring that perimeter to the endpoint and stuff like that, you're kind of managing a zero trust asset at that point, right? You're managing how something accesses that particular asset. And I think that that's both interesting and doable.
Right.
Nice. Well, this has been fascinating. I appreciate you coming on, Dave, and I know that,
I'd like to see Dave come back because I think we could talk about more stuff.
I agree. I would love to see you come back as well. That's 2 votes right there. So as long as Dave doesn't run
Get
out
the
of
golden ticket.
what a bunch of knuckleheads. I'm not talking to these guys again. which he said before, but he always comes back because we're friends for how many years?
I
Uh,
don't even think of. I will if I think about how many years it is, Andrew. I will cry. You know,
uh,
because I think you and I actually, because I met you before I met Angelo, and that was right at the beginning of both of our McAfee
yep,
careers, and it was Network
was.
Associates. That's how
It
long ago
was.
that was. It
Yep,
wasn't
the
even
offer letter said Network Associates. That's right.
And when did you guys, just as a foray back in time, when did you guys start at McAfee
oh
or
04,
Network Associates?
04, yeah.
oh
04.
04.
All right.
Yeah. We came into the Santa Clara office about the same time, and it's like, oh hi, you're an evangelist too. Awesome.
Yep, yep, that's
Not an
exactly
army of
right.
one. Yep.
Yep. How
Uh,
about you, Angelo? When was your what year were you?
May 2000, May 2000. Started an EPO point zero eight, we'll call it.
Wow.
EPO on a floppy disk.
Management
Literally.
edition. Yeah, it
Wow.
was nasty. It was a nasty world.
It was.
Wow. That's when it literally managed AV and AV only. It only managed virus scan at that
Yeah.
point.
When
That's
they
it.
had two database engines sitting on the same server, and they were replicating to each other because no one could figure out how to build a report and anything but crystal reports, but couldn't figure out how to manage it. That's a different world. So
Okay,
Oof.
now I'm shuddering. I know.
Oh,
And with
well,
that,
Andrew,
folks,
here's a bit of history. Here's a bit of history for you. Andrew's the first customer that turned Interfield on in blocking mode, and I actually remember that.
and when he shut down his entire network, what
There you
happened? No, I'm
go.
kidding.
no, actually, I was a success story because it was the same weekend SQL Slammer. It was a Super Bowl weekend.
Oh wow.
And I turned it on before because I saw some funky stuff going on. I had these appliances. I turned them on in prevention because, hey, the manufacturer said you could prevent. So I did. Was fine. But I saw
Yep.
these alerts just kept popping up and popping up and popping up, and they're
Yep.
being blocked. And I'm like, a whole weekend, I couldn't tell you who played the Super Bowl to save my life, but I remember seeing blocked, blocked, blocked.
Yep.
Monday, nothing happened, but my bank card was not working at the ATM, so I knew they got hit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Fascinating. You know, and it's one of those things. That's kind of like one of those watershed defining moments,
Oh
right?
yeah.
You know, it's like number one, you're just like, well, why shouldn't I turn it on, right? You know,
It's
I
there.
literally, what do I have to lose? You know what I have to lose? Not getting my network owned. That's what I have, you know, to lose.
Exactly.
So that's kind of a binary decision, really, when you think about it. This, you know, but you know, props because you were literally the first one that did it, and
Yeah.
and I remember the discussion we had, and you were just like, they couldn't believe I turned it on to blocking mode. They, you know, and it's just like, well, why wouldn't I?
I don't know why every time I called the help desk, I went right to tier 3.
Yep.
It didn't dawn on me.
Wow, you want to
But,
talk about old school, baby? You know,
yeah, that's it. That's it.
that's
Well, Dave,
remarkable.
well, we really appreciate you jumping on with us, and we thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity soon to get you on and do some more. But we always like to wrap up with this, and we always like to have a favorite quote or saying that we run into. And I was wondering if you had a favorite quote that you like to, preferably something appropriate for
Yeah, our general audience.
our general audience.
I guess I guess my years doing intelligence actually have made a big impact on me because things that stick with me are like quantify what you can quantify, you know, and that's kind of all encompassing, right? Is know what you can know, you know, and realize there's stuff that you can't quantify and you can't ever know, but do your best with what you can quantify, you know, and I think that that's pretty relevant in the cybers, you know.
Yeah,
Great.
very relevant. Angela, what's yours? Your favorite one?
Very similar. I steal mine from whomever I could find them from, and mine is complexity is the enemy of security. You can't figure it out. You can't explain it. You're probably not secure. And
Good
that
one.
I think I stole from Schneer, but also may have. And I think Schmidt also quoted him, or vice versa. I'm not sure what the origination is,
That's a
but
good
I
one.
steal it fair and square. So
There you
I
go.
like that. What did you say? Complexity is the enemy of security.
correct.
I like that.
Yep.
How about you, Andrew?
The best security device resides between our ears if we use it.
You
I
so
can live with
choose.
that. That's a good one too.
And with that, we thank you for attending the podcast and hope to see you on our next episode of Cyber Insanity. Don't forget to like and subscribe, especially with Dave and Marcus on here. We want to make sure we get them back. So like and subscribe a lot.
Click this
Multiple
link.
times. That's it. Yeah, wherever the pointer is going to
Yeah.
point.
Dave,
So
you can point someplace. Yeah.
there you go. There you go. Thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to the next podcast.
Awesome.